Hey, how's it going? So in my video where I talked about where mental health issues come from, I mentioned how all mental health issues stem from trauma, and I feel like this can be hard to believe that pretty much every mental health issue does stem from trauma, and it feels sort of like an oversimplification to say that. So I wanted to make this video going more in depth on exactly how mental health issues stem from trauma and all the different ways in which that happens. I won't be able to go in depth on everything in this video. This is sort of just a brief overview of the various ways, but I do plan on making lots of different videos in the future on each of these different areas of how mental health issues and neurotic behaviors and things like that can be created by trauma and how it all stems back to trauma. So the first and most direct way that mental health issues get created by trauma is through emotional triggers. I talked about these in my last two videos. So these are basically like the most direct way that mental health issues are created. So this is when you have a reaction to something and it sort of feels like it's over the top or it's unnecessary, or it's just some sort of strong negative emotion that you feel and you generally don't understand why it's there. But this emotion is a trigger coming from the trauma, and the reason it's there is it's trying to call your attention towards it and towards the trauma and get you to listen to it and be with it until you can feel through it and heal it. So it's there for the sake of calling your attention to this trauma so you can address it and heal it. And so this is like the most foundational mental health issue sort of that's created by trauma, because it's the most direct thing that's sort of calling your attention back to the trauma. So triggers include things like anger issues or self-worth issues and like feeling shame or like you're not good enough, anxiety or depression. Lots of different things can be triggers. Generally when people deal with triggers, they tend to push them away because they don't understand why they're there. But this just makes the problem worse because this is a hurt emotion that you're dealing with, and by pushing it away you're just hurting it more and it causes you more pain. And so the right way to deal with triggers is to understand that these are not there to hurt you, and they're there to like these are your emotions asking for healing, and so you need to empathize with them and try to be understanding of them and try your best to surrender to them and allow them to be there instead of resisting them. So another way in which mental health issues are created through trauma is by being emotionally impaired. So this basically means that when you go through trauma and emotions get blocked, you lose access to those emotions. And so when that happens, because your emotions are so important for your survival and they're there to give you guidance and direction in your life, if you're missing some of your emotions because they're blocked and you can't access them, then your survival is impaired in the same way that an animal's survival would be impaired if it lost its defense mechanisms or something like that. And so in that sense, what your mind does to compensate for that is it makes you really fearful because you've lost access to part of your emotions, which are crucial for your survival. You become really vulnerable, and so your mind needs to make you really fearful for the sake of your survival. So this fear can manifest as anxiety issues, but it can also just be general fear. Generally, the more hurt and wounded someone is and the more distance they are from their emotions, the more fearful they'll be, because the more like impaired they are and the more they need to be fearful. Another thing that sort of correlates with this is selfishness. Selfishness and fear sort of go hand in hand. They're there sort of for the same reason. They're there because of a need within the self that's not being met, and so you need to sort of be overly concerned with yourself and be very careful and things like that because of how hurt you are and how much you're lacking. I think a lot of people criticize others and also criticize themselves for being really fearful or selfish or needy and things like that. But hopefully from what I've explained, you can see that these things are there for a very good reason, and instead of trying to push them away and judge and criticize yourself or others for having them. Understand that they're there for a good reason, and they need to be treated with understanding and compassion and things like that, and that will allow you to deal with them much more effectively. Another thing that trauma can create in a person is neuroses. These are basically just negative behaviors or habits that you adopt. Things such as being manipulative, being really judgmental and critical of others, being impulsive, having a bad temper, caring about what other people think of you, being a people pleaser, things like that. You can sort of see that these types of behaviors are all sort of like low sort of things that like people realize that they aren't good to be doing, but they're sort of like emotionally driven behaviors. So you can sort of get a sense that they would be created through some sort of emotional dysfunction. So all neuroses are basically trauma-induced survival strategies. So different neuroses exist for different reasons, but they all involve ensuring your survival and getting your needs met in one way or another. When you've been traumatized, your needs haven't been met directly in a healthy way through like getting love from your parents or the people around you. And so because of that, when you're traumatized, you live in a sort of impaired state where you've been hurt and your needs aren't met. And so because you weren't able to get them met directly, you have to sort of develop crafty and deceptive sort of ways of getting them met. This happens all unconsciously, so you don't think about doing this. All neuroses are there basically to help to ensure your survival and your safety in the traumatized state that you're stuck in. I think these sorts of neurotic behaviors are things that are very common for people to try and work on when they get into personal development. Like things such as like being argumentative, or like having like anxiety issues or people pleasing issues, being like critical of people, like procrastinating, being lazy. All these sorts of things are very common for people who are into self-help and personal development for them to sort of work on. I think what people don't realize is that they try and solve these problems on the surface. They don't realize the root of where these problems come from. They don't realize that they stem from trauma. And so because these issues are there for a good reason, they're there to help you survive in the sort of impaired and traumatized state that you're in. They're not going to go away easily just because you want them to. And so people will try and get rid of them without solving the trauma underneath. And they think that these issues are there for no reason, and they think that they can just correct them. And in a sense, like, you can make some progress with overcoming neuroses, like without solving the trauma underneath. I find that some are more stick more than others. Like for myself, I've noticed that some issues I can get rid of completely just by noticing things that I do, and then consciously deciding to stop doing it and preventing myself from it. And for some things that works, and that's enough. But for other things, I have such a strong motivation to do them that it's very difficult for me to stop doing them, even if I want to. And if I do force myself to stop, there's like a strong emotional reaction there, which is understandable because it's a survival mechanism from trauma, and you're sort of hurt without them. And so, like I said, you can make some progress overcoming neuroses by just working with them directly and without addressing the trauma. But you need to keep in mind that this isn't the root solution, and so you can only get so far with this kind of strategy, and it's possible that the work that you do will be undone, and these issues will come back up later because you're not getting to the root of them. What I recommend is, if you're willing to go all the way with healing and your goal is to try and heal as deep as possible, well, I'd say it's healthy to try and like limit your neuroses if you can, just by becoming aware of them. But other than that, you don't need to do any serious work on them, and I wouldn't bother doing any of that. I would just go straight to addressing the trauma, because once you heal and integrate that trauma, because all of your neurotic behaviors come from that trauma and they're like survival adaptations from it, once this trauma is solved and healed and integrated, they won't have any need to be there, and so they'll just fall away on their own without you having to do anything at all. And so that's really the best way to solve these neurotic issues. I think the key is just understanding that all of these issues are there for a good reason. Like, they're there because of trauma, and so you can't expect yourself to just give them all up and let go of them all completely without healing yourself and giving yourself the love that you need. These neurotic behaviors are there to ensure your survival and to keep you safe because you're in a traumatized state, and so you're really going against yourself and fighting an uphill battle by trying to remove these issues without resolving the trauma that's underneath. I think that's just so important to understand, and if you approached it in that way, you'd have much better success at removing all of your neuroses instead of just trying to remove them one by one without like looking at the trauma or anything. Another way that trauma creates mental health issues is through emotional avoidance strategies. So when you have trauma, like the triggers that I talked about before, you live in a constant state of feeling like the traumatized emotions. Like, you don't feel it that strongly on the surface, but they always are like underlying, and you always feel them deep down at least a little bit. And so your constant state is sort of like partially influenced by the trauma. And so because of that, it's very common for traumatized people to develop strategies to avoid their emotions. And this can come in many ways, such as addictions, projections, and so which is like focusing things out on, like projecting things out on other people instead of like for the sake of avoiding your own emotions. It just leads to a lot of avoidance and trying to escape your emotions and run away from them. And this causes a lot of problems in itself, just that you're running away from yourself and not being there for yourself and your emotions. And also, like, losing connection with your emotions means you sort of lose touch with feeling, and like when you're in your body, you're feeling, and so because of that you try and escape being in your body, and so it makes you very ungrounded as well, and out of touch with your body. There's just a lot of different problems that are caused by trying to avoid or suppress or project out your emotions to get away from them. And these things are all caused by trauma, just because like I said, when you have trauma, you're constantly living in a state of feeling that trauma like a little bit beneath the surface, and so that is what creates these behaviors. So hopefully this shows you like a bunch of different ways in which trauma can cause mental health issues and influence not just like negative emotions like anxiety or depression or whatever, but also just negative habits and neuroses and things like that. Like, hopefully this video shows you just how big of an impact that trauma has on your life, and I haven't even touched all of it. This is just like a brief overview of some of the points. There's still more for me to mention later, but I'm definitely going to be making lots of videos going on in depth on each of these points, just explaining more clearly exactly how they work. But yeah, hopefully this was helpful to you. So please leave a like on this video. It really helps the channel grow and get this out to other people, and I'd appreciate it. Leave a comment if you want. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I just like to hear your input on this. And make sure to subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this in the future, and I'll see you next time.